right. All right, good evening. Glad you guys are here tonight. I want to give you just a couple of words of instruction before we begin. You got an email yesterday from Autumn, which was great, reminding you kind of the path we're going down. Next week, we will not meet. Next week is a time for you to come and check out what they're offering at other times, specifically 6 o'clock, because I already have you at 7:15, so that's great. And so 6 o'clock, they're having different classes offered, starting the second part of this semester for CrossLife University. In fact, Tim Dix will be teaching the theology of, or the doctrine of God. Pastor Mercer will be teaching a leadership class. I will be continuing the Old Testament. In fact, a while ago, Pastor said, you've gone halfway through the Old Testament. Next week, a couple weeks, you'll pick back up. You probably are in the book of Psalms by then, right, Doug? And I'm like, we'll be out of the law by then, right? So, and thanks for a few of you in here started laughing. So, and then the next week is spring break. We won't meet. So we will actually, after tonight, be back the 25th of March. And then our last 8 weeks, we will cover from beyond the law, the promised land, all the way to the end of the Old Testament. So you're going to be here for that, all right? So let's pray, and then we're going to get started. God, I love you. I thank you for tonight. I thank you for those that are here. I pray for those that maybe couldn't make it for whatever reason. But God, I just pray you would bless our time together. May we learn so much about what's going on in the Old Testament, and may we look at the rebellion of the people of Israel and be reminded of our own sinfulness, our own rebellion, and yet we see your grace with them, and it reminds us of how much you show us grace, Lord. So be with us tonight. May you bless our time. In your name we pray. Everybody said amen? Amen. All right, so we're going to do a real quick recap. You can grab your notes there if you want to. And I kind of want to just make sure we're all on the same page, because some of you, maybe you haven't been here the whole time, and just want to kind of bring you up to speed. We began with the book of Genesis, obviously, and that book's all about origins, right? That book's all about origins. And we said there's 3 basic new beginnings in Genesis. We have creation, which was the first beginning. Then we have life after the flood, right? There was Noah, the ark, and the flood. Then kind of life begins again. And then after the Tower of Babel, we see that again. It's kind of another creation. Also in the book of Genesis, we see the beginning of a covenant with who? Who was it with? Abraham, right? He said, I'm going to make you a father of a great nation, as the stars you see in the skies, how numerous your offspring are going to be. And so we see the beginning of a covenant. And then at the end of Genesis, we see a guy named Joseph come up, who is a man of great character, great integrity, loves the Lord. But he also is in that season of Israel's history before they're a nation where there is a famine in the land, and they come seeking help, and they come to Egypt where Joseph was, and they offer help, and eventually, because of the famine, they just stay. And Pharaoh says, hey, there's a lot of these people, and they're growing in numbers. And if they grow too big, it's going to be a problem for us, so let's just enslave them. And so since the new king did not know Joseph, didn't have a relationship with Joseph, the Egyptians put the Israelites in captivity. And they were in captivity for 400 years. They were slaves for 400 years. And then they began to cry out to God, and God raised up who? Who did God raise up in Exodus to deliver? Moses, right? He raised up Moses to go deliver them, and they go, and that's where we see the plagues. That's where we see the Passover. We see them march through the Red Sea. God parts the waters, and they begin their way to the place of Mount Sinai. Now, Mount Sinai was very, very crucial, because at Mount Sinai is where God began this idea of covenant with a nation. It's moved from a person to a nation. Now he's making a covenant with the nation of Israel. And one thing we learn, which I hope you don't forget, it may be the most important thing I've said the whole time, is this: that within covenant, there's always what? Law, right? And we saw the Hittite structure of their covenant structure played out in Exodus chapter 20. We'll talk about that more here in a minute. But there was part of that covenant had stipulations, which is the law. And then as we got through the book of Exodus, we saw one of the most beautiful pictures of the thread of redemption in the tabernacle. We saw the significance of the elements in the tabernacle, but the best thing about the tabernacle was that God has this new nation, and he realized they needed a place to worship him. So he institutes a tabernacle, all the pieces of it, and exactly how they're to worship within the tabernacle. And then we come into the book of Leviticus, which Leviticus is all about approaching and living in the presence of a holy God. How do we approach a holy God, and how do we live in the presence of a holy God? And we said this: the only way to approach a holy God was through what? You might remember? Atonement, which means sacrifice, right? It's through sacrifice. And so there was 5 offerings that Israel was given, that we talked about, and the most important day in Israel's history was the Day of Atonement, the day that the priest would sacrifice a bull for himself. He would take 2 goats. He would sacrifice one representing the sins of Israel, and then he would take the other one, which was known as the scapegoat, and he would place both hands on it as if he was transferring the sins of Israel to the scapegoat, and then the scapegoat was let loose and it left as a picture of how God forgave sin, right? And so it was a big day, and so how do we approach a holy God? Through sacrifice. Now here's the imagery I hope we didn't miss. How do we approach a holy God? Through sacrifice. But not our sacrifice, but Christ's sacrifice. And through him, we can have a right standing with him, right? Does that make sense? Amen? Okay, so that's what it's about. And then also the idea in Leviticus was, how do we live in the presence of a holy God? And so the last half of the book, really from chapters 8 on, was all about 2 really things. One of it was purity laws, about clean and unclean. What is clean? What is unclean? What do we have to do? It dealt with kind of the physical side of things. And then you get into the holiness code, which was how we are to live a life set apart, which is very spiritual driven. So you've got this origins, you've got slavery and deliverance, this new nation, and then you got this book of Leviticus. It's like, hey, we're in covenant together. Here's how I want you to approach me. Here's how I want you to live in my presence. I will be your God, and you will be my people, and I want you set apart. Here's what set apart looks like. Now tonight we're going to look at 2 books. We're going to look at Numbers and Deuteronomy. Now, some people, as they look at the law, want to bypass Numbers and want to go quick sell through Deuteronomy. We're going to go a little bit quicker through Deuteronomy, but the book of Numbers is extraordinarily important to the law. There's so much in the book of Numbers. It's not just a list of numbers. It is that. There's a lot of numbers in the book of Numbers. But it's more than that. There's so much that's going on in there. So I want to give you some overarching themes that you find in the book of Numbers that you'll see in a minute. One is it's all about preparation for the land. The whole book of Numbers is about them as a nation. Now that they have covenant, now they know stipulations, now they know how to approach a holy God through tabernacle, now they know how to live in the presence of a holy God through clean and unclean, being pure, and all those, and the holiness code being set apart. Now they know all that stuff. Now it's this idea of, now we're getting you ready to take the land. Now we're preparing you. Now, here's why that's important. Because guess what's in the land that God had prepared for them? What's in the land that God prepared for them? Don't say milk and honey flowing. We know that, right? But what was in the land that God had for them? Enemies, other nations. Now let's just think about this from a God standpoint, which I know we're not assuming to be God, but let's think about that. God has established a covenant with people. You will be my people, I will be your God. He's told them how to live within that covenant. Here are the way to stay clean and pure. Here's the way to stay set aside. Here's how to approach me. He's given them all this information. Why? So when they enter into the promised land and they encounter all these different nationalities, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, all those people, you will still be my people. You won't get lost in the mix. You won't begin to follow their gods. You won't begin to follow their customs. You will be my people who always live a life set apart. That makes sense, right? That God would do that before they go into the land, right? Does that make sense? The problem is they pay attention to none of it, right? So the point is this: as you get into Numbers, part of the book of Numbers is all about, I want to get you ready to take the land. Now, why is that important? Because when they take the land, listen to this, when they take the land, this is promises fulfilled, right? Did God promise Abraham a land? Yes. Did he promise a nation of a numerous amount of descendants? Yes. And when they take the land, this would have been promise fulfilled. So the book of Numbers is a lot about taking the land. Another overarching theme is God's faithfulness. One thing, and I don't know about you, how many of you took the last week, and I may be disappointed in the answer here, so maybe I won't ask this, but how many of you took the last week and you kind of read through the book of Numbers a little bit? Anybody? Okay, great. There's a few godly people. Oh, good. So, all right, no. So I've read through the Numbers numerous times, and I got to be honest. As I was reading through the book of Numbers, I found myself getting frustrated with Israel all over again. Because as you read through Numbers, here's what you find out. They are the whiniest group of people. Seriously, read it. They are the whiniest group of people. They complain, they grumble, they rebel, and yet all the way through it, God's grace is obvious all the way through the book of Numbers. There's points twice in the book of Numbers. There's 2 times in the book of Numbers. God is ready to wipe everybody out. He's like, I'm just done. I'm done, and I'm going to wipe them out. And Moses and Aaron fall on their face and begin to plead with God. Now, there's just times if I'm Moses, I would be like, God, I'm with you. Just wipe them out. Wipe them out. But he doesn't do that. He gets on his face and prays. And so the second overarching theme I want you to really think about, especially as you read Numbers, is it's the faithfulness of God. In the face of complaining, in the face of grumbling, in the face of rebellion, God stayed faithful to love his people even when they were unlovable. Now I'm going to tell you something real quick that's really good news. Sometimes I'm pretty unlovable. Aren't you? But even through my whining, even through my complaining, even through my grumbling, and sometimes even in the midst of my rebellion, there's a faithful God who still loves me in the face of all of that, right? So I found out this truth for me. You ready? As I read through Numbers, the reason I was so frustrated with Israel, because it's easier for me to be frustrated with the sins of Israel than it is to be frustrated with my own sins, right? And so I'm reminded of the faithfulness of God. And then the third overarching theme, which I love, is a theme of testing. In the book of Numbers, we see one of the largest tests that Israel is about to face. And we'll get to it in a minute. It's the test of checking out the land. God's brought them to the land, ready to occupy the land. I want you to go test it out. I want you to go, and I want you to see, and I want you to bring back a report. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, the original name for the book of Numbers, as it relates to testing, was not Numbers. It was In the Wilderness. That was the original name of the book of Numbers. In the wilderness, because as you find out, that's where they spend all their time, right? In the wilderness, in the book of Numbers, right? That's where they spend. Now, the thing about it is that God did not design the wilderness to be their destination. He was wanting them to pass through the wilderness to get to their destination. It was a place to move through, but as we find in the book of Numbers, they don't. They rebel, they sin, they wander, and the book of Numbers then becomes this notion of how did they get here? How did God deal with them while they were there? But lastly, how did God bring them out of the wilderness? Now, kind of a fun fact for you. I don't know if you know this or not, or maybe you don't even care, but I thought it was interesting. It's an interesting fact is the book of Exodus covers a period of 4 years. If you take a whole book of Exodus, it covers 4 years. The book of Leviticus covers 1 month. The book of Numbers covers almost 40 years. Now think about that. That's why the book of Numbers adds so much context to the law. And what we're learning is because here's a people who are spending almost over 38 years, almost 40 years in a wilderness because of the rebellion. Now, when you look at the book of Numbers, there's 3 major sections of the book of Numbers. The first section is the departure from Sinai. They're at Sinai and they're about to leave. From Sinai to Kadesh. Let's leave this subtitle. I'm going to come back to this in a second here. And then Kadesh to the plains of Moab. Now, I put this up there. We were going to print it for you, but it didn't print very well. I want you to just kind of know where the path was. So at the time we get into Numbers, they're down here at Mount Sinai, and they're beginning their way all the way up to Kadesh, and from Kadesh to Moab. Now, interestingly enough, just a thought for you to think about, from Sinai to the land of Canaan, right up here, is an 11-day journey that took them 40 years to get there. Think about that. 11-day journey that took 40 years. Now here's a thought I was thinking about was they were so close for much of their journey, but yet spiritually so far away. They were close to the land that God had promised them for years, but because of the rebellion, they wandered. So this is where Sinai is when the book of Numbers starts. Kadesh is where part of the book is that it talks about, and then the rest of the book of Numbers talks about as they make their journey to the area, the plain of Moab. So I want you to be aware of that. So let's look at these 3 specific areas. First of all, the departure from Sinai. The departure from Sinai happens in chapter 1 through chapter 10, most of chapter 10, first 10 verses of 10. It talks about the departure from Sinai. Now, there's some big pieces in these chapters. One is they take the first census as a nation. Now you may think, well, why would they do that? Well, because as you enter into a promised land, now remember, at this point, at Sinai, they're beginning the 11-day journey. Are you with me on that? They're beginning an 11-day track to get to the promised land. That's what they're beginning to do. So when you enter the promised land, one thing they know is there are enemies in the promised land. And what are you going to have to do with those enemies? Oh, excuse me, could y'all just kind of slide out of Jericho because this is kind of our space anyway? Do you mind moving for us? What do? No. They got to fight, right? And so they took a census to determine the size of the army that they were going to have and a way to organize themselves. See, this part of the book of Numbers is all about being militarily prepared. Make sure our military is ready. Up to this point, had Israel had to fight much? Had they had to have a massive army? No, they were slaves in Egypt, right? They were slaves, and then they were like nomads in the desert, and they were getting like manna from heaven, and there's this cloud, and there's this fire. I mean, they hadn't had to fight anybody, but now they're going to have to fight. They're going to have to occupy the land, and there's going to be battles that come up. So they took a census to find out how many people do we have that can fight. They wanted to be ready from a military standpoint. One thing you'll find out in these passages, these chapters, is that the tribe of Levi is excluded. The tribe of Levi was not a fighting tribe. They were what? You remember what their role was? They were priests. So it was all about the worship. And there's something about that, right? Some of you oftentimes wonder, why did David not get to build the temple? Well, did anybody know why he didn't build the temple? Too much bloodshed, right? Too much bloodshed. And so there was a big deal about the Levites not being a part of that. The second big piece of these first 10 chapters is the arrangement of the camp. In fact, we have a picture of that. I've showed you this before, but this was the arrangement of the camp. You see the tabernacle, I'm sorry, I'm in your way, in the middle, and this was the arrangement of the camp. You had basically the 12 tribes surrounding the encampment there. And so a large part of Numbers is talking about that, but it goes further into detail, and it begins in one part to talk about the roles of the Levites. One of the big areas they talk about is, what is the role of these priests? Interestingly enough, by this time, Aaron had two sons, Nadab and Abihu, who you remember from last week, they what? They're dead, right? They're gone, right? But he's got two other sons. He's got Eleazar and Ithamar, and now they're rise to the occasion, and now they're priests. And what are their roles? What are the duties of these Levite priests? And then it actually gets specific in these chapters and dealing with the duties of the three clans of Levites. There's three clans. They won't be on the screen. You might want to write them down. The first one was the Kohathites. K-O-H-A. K-O-H-A-T-H-I-T-E. Kohathite. The Gershonites. That was even easier to spell, right? G-E-R-S-H-O-N-I-T-E. Gershonite. And then Merarite, M-E-R-A-R-I-T-E. That's the three basic clans, Meronite. That's the three basic clans of Levites. Every clan had a specific responsibilities that Numbers outlines. And I'm going to give you what those are, for example, so you don't have to read it later. But the Kohathites were in charge of moving the Ark of the Covenant. They were in charge of the table of showbread. They were in charge of other holy things. Things that were viewed as holy. They were the clan that was in charge of making sure that when this tabernacle was up and it moved, because remember, now they're on the move, right? Now they're going from Sinai and beginning to journey to the promised land. So as they move and as the cloud leads them and where it stops, they stop. As they move, you got to have a group that moves the most sacred place, which is the tabernacle. So this group, the Kohathites, were in charge of the ark, the table of showbread, and the holy things. So the lampstand, the altar of incense. They were in charge of what was viewed as holy stuff. And then you had the Gershonites. They were in charge of the decorations, like the curtains and the coverings. Most scholars would say that they were in charge of moving the veil. So anything that was curtain or covering, that was their job. And then you had the Merarites, who were the grunts. They were in charge of moving the tabernacle structure. So they were moving pillars, they were moving everything that was related to the structure of the tabernacle. So all three clans had exactly their responsibilities. And so you see that in the book of Numbers in these first 10 chapters. And then you see toward the end of the chapter, like 8, 9, and 10, you see a conversation again about the purity and maintaining purity in the camp. So you see a rehashing a little bit. He talks about things like putting that which is unclean outside the camp. Now, why did they do that? Remember I was talking about last week? Why did you put that which is unclean outside the camp? Yeah, because if it's unclean in the camp, ceremonially, it corrupts everything else. So someone with leprosy, they go outside the camp, right? You can't have them in the camp because they're corrupting and infecting everybody else. So he rehashes that. He rehashes the notion of making restitution. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. He rehashed the notion of how to deal with marital unfaithfulness. What is faithfulness? How do we deal with marital unfaithfulness? All that's in the chapters like 8, 9, and 10 of Numbers. But one thing he talks about in chapter 6, I want to point out, is he talks about something called the Nazarite Vow in the book of Numbers. Now, the Nazarite Vow was an extraordinary vow of devotion. You know, we talked about setting apart as a nation. That's like level 2. Level 1, like if you really want to be devoted to God, like if you were going to raise the bar like nobody's business, you took a Nazarite vow. The Nazarite vow was voluntary. You were not forced to take the Nazarite vow. It was for those who said, I want to be so devoted to God, even beyond what God has already asked me to do, even beyond the purity laws, even beyond the holiness code. I want to raise my game to a level where I'm so set apart and devoted to God that everybody knows it. If that was you, you took the Nazarite vow. And it wasn't just for men. Men and women could take the Nazarite vow. And something that oftentimes we don't know, and I'm going to read this a little bit, some things we don't know sometimes is the vow, for the most part, was seasonal, meaning it wasn't for all of your life. Let me read a couple of passages, and then I'll give you the exception. In chapter 6, verse 8, it says this. It won't be on the screen. It says this. All the days, talking about the Nazarite vow, all the days of his separation, in other words, being consecrated, set apart, he is holy to the Lord. All the days of a separation. The implication is there's a time where that ends. There's a beginning and there's an end to this Nazarite vow. Verse 13 of the same chapter says, and this is the law for the Nazarite when the time of his separation has come to an end or has been completed. So for the most part, the Nazarite vow, when you took it, there's a beginning to it and an end to it. Many scholars will tell you that many of those Nazarite vows were 30 days. Many were shorter, some were longer. On a couple occasions, you can think of one I know, that a parent took the Nazarite vow for their kids for the entirety of their life. Can you think of an example of that? Samson, right? Samson didn't have a 30-day beginning and end. That was Samson's life, right? And so the vow was something that had a season, and with a vow came restrictions, right? You know, remember what the restrictions are? Anybody remember any of the restrictions? Okay. No strong drink, right? No wine. No razor, and what was the other one? No dead animals. No corpses. You couldn't touch them, okay? And there were severe consequences if you did, right? And so as they're leaving Mount Sinai, all this stuff is going on. And so the departure from Sinai is filled with, we need to have a fighting group. We need to know how to move the tabernacle, and we need to make sure we know how to stay pure. So this nation of Israel gathered around Mount Sinai. They've got the covenant. They've got the instructions. They understand how to approach a holy God, how to live in the presence of a holy God. Now it's all about, we got to get ready for battle. We have to make sure we bring the tabernacle and carry it the way God wants us to carry it. Now, do you think God cared about the way they took the Ark of the Covenant and carried? You think God cared about that stuff? If you don't, just read about Uzzah, right? Uzzah touched it because it was falling, and he died, right? So God's instructions were clear about what to do. And then last of all, this whole section is about staying pure. As you enter into this land, I want you to stay pure. And if you really want to be committed, take the Nazarite vow. No strong drink, no razor, no dead bodies you can touch, no dead carcasses, nothing. I want you to elevate your game like you've never elevated it before. Why would the Nazarite vow be important for Israel as they're about to march into a new land? Why would that be important? Separate them, right? But they had stuff to separate them, right? I mean, there were some laws already in place to separate. So why the Nazarite vow?
Personal.
Where are we at? Personal. Okay, how was it personal?
Well, it was something that they agreed to do on their own.
Yeah.
And that means they would keep themselves pure.
Yeah, so it's not about, hey, all of us. It's about me. My personal devotion to God. I love that. That's really good. Anybody think of anything else? That's really good. Anything else? Okay, good. So I'm with you. I think it's personal. I think the whole idea with the Nazarite vow is, yeah, as a nation, we got some protocol we got to live by, but I'm going to rise up and I'm going to say, this is my commitment to the Lord. This is my devotion to the Lord, right? And it's a further way to set themselves apart. Then you move from the departure to Sinai to from Sinai to Kadesh. From Sinai to Kadesh, the area of Kadesh. And this is from chapters 10 through chapter 20. And we'll get to reading a lot more passages here in a minute. And the first thing you see is them talk about the arrangement of the tribes marching. We've talked about who's carrying what, right? Right, we got that. And then there's an arrangement of how they march. You can see how they encamped, but notice here, this is how they're to march, we're told in chapter 10. So the ark is first, and then you got these three tribes, and then you got these different clans of Levites and what they're doing. These three tribes, the Kohathites, and you get all these different people. Now, which way are they marching? This way or that way? If you look at this, going this way. Now, what do you notice about that would be important? What? The ark's always going first, right? Why is the significance of the ark going first? Okay, that's all good answers. I didn't hear any of them. Raise your hand. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, everywhere we go, we are led by the presence of Almighty God, right? Let me give an example when they didn't do this. Is when after Jericho, this amazing battle, they won. Then they battled a town about the size of Chuliota. They went from Orlando, won a battle, to a place like Chuliota called Ai. And the presence of God did not lead them into battle, and they suffered a serious defeat. And I love this chart because it reminds me, even when they're marching and about to go into the promised land, when they're marching that way, that the presence of God is always leading them. Now, can you imagine the reminder that should be for all of us? No matter where we go, what should be guiding us and leading us? God should be leading us, right? That's right. So there's some significance to that. So when you start this chapter, the first thing you see is the arrangement of how they're to march. And then you see, next of all, in chapter 11, is that people began to complain, right? And it's coming. So I want us to read some of the complaints that they pose. So we're going to do a little bit of reading here. Chapter 11, verse 1 through 3. Listen to this. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. Now, that doesn't mean they went and they prayed. And God heard what they were saying. God knew what they were talking about. Prayed about the misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outer lying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and fire died down. So the name of the Lord was a place called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now, just real quickly, what happened? Real quickly, just talk to me. What just happened there? God's on the move. They're on the move, right? They're going, where are they going? Promised land, baby. I mean, we are going to milk and honey. We are going to the place that God has for us. And instead of there being joy and excitement and enthusiasm and high-fiving and can't wait to get there, there's complaining, right? And what were they complaining about? Somebody raise their hand. Yeah, what were they complaining about?
They were probably complaining about the rules and how hard it was and how far it might be and the unknown.
And then how did God respond to that? You're right. How did God respond to that? He punished them with fire, right? Right. And it's almost like God said, okay, now I'm going to show you something. And he showed him that he's in control, right? So I'm thinking that nips it in the bud, right? Aren't you? I'm thinking God's taking out the outer extremities of this camp. People have been impacted by this. You know, they had to go to Moses. Moses cries out. The fire dies down. I'm thinking at this point, Israel's going, let's just keep our mouths shut and let's just keep following God. Isn't that what you would think? We know that's not what happened. Now listen, verse 4. They go to verse 4. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we would have meat to eat. We remember when the fish we ate in the Egypt and they cost nothing, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. Now think about that. You ungrateful, right? I mean, you just finished the sentence, right? I mean, if I'm God, I'm ready to take you out too. If I'm Moses, I'm like, God, I'm done. I don't know what to tell. I mean, I don't know what to do, God. I've said everything you said, and they still, I mean, they've gone from complaining, fire broke out. Now they're like, I just wish we had some meat to eat. I'm so sick of looking at manna. I'm so sick of it. I remember when back in the Egypt days, they forget that they were in slavery, by the way. I remember when we were back in Egypt, and man, we had fish, and we had melons, and it was like catfish. It was so good, and we had melons, we had onions, and garlic. You remember garlic? I remember garlic, and they just began to complain, right? They wanted meat to eat. Look what happens in verse 31. I love this. Then a wind from the Lord sprang up, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on the side and a day's journey on the other side around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the ground. And the people rose all that day and night, and all the next day, and gathered the quail. Those who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. In other words, let's be honest, they grabbed as much as they could get, and they hid it in places nobody else would go find it, right? That's what they did. And so look what goes on next. This gets even better. While the meat was yet between their teeth, before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague. Therefore, the name of the place was Kibroth. You can announce the rest of it. Because they were buried, the people who had the cravings. In other words, what happened? These people that were complaining about meat, and they had these deep, deep cravings, God provided some meat. But rather than having gratitude, they started gorging themselves, right? They're taking all they can get, and they're hiding it, and they're just shoveling it down. And as they're shoveling it down, God sends a plague to punish them, right? He sends a plague to punish them. And I guess the thing that I wrote in my notes, I thought, how easily we forget the goodness of God, right? How easily do we forget? Now, if that story's not bad enough, then you go to chapter 12. And the 2 people that should have been on Moses' side more than anybody else is Aaron and Miriam. And they begin to rebel. They start speaking against Moses. They start thinking that they could do better than Moses. They actually stood before a holy God at the tent of meetings with a cloud there, and they basically said, we're better than Moses. We can do this better than Moses. And God gives us great discourse about how he called Moses, how he loves Moses, how Moses is the man, and they still complain, and Miriam ends up with what? Anybody know what happens to Miriam? Leprosy. And now, if I'm Moses, come on, you got to read your Bible. Isn't it good? If I'm Moses, I'm going, you deserve that one, sis, right? I mean, I would. Hey, sis, you earned that one. Is that what Moses did? He begins to cry and plead for God to heal her, right? But yet she had to leave the city for 7 days till she was clean, and then she could come back in. Now, you would think, okay, the people have complained. God sent fire. The people complained about not having meat. He gave them meat. Instead of gratitude, they're gorging themselves, and so he sends a plague. And now the high priest, Aaron, and Moses' sister have kind of thrown him under the bus. You think, okay, it's not going to get any worse than this. Because remember, we're going to the promised land. We're going to the place with milk and honey. We're going to the place where there's not bondage. We're going to the place of prosperity. We are moving to the place that you would think there would be an excitement for that, right? Are you with me on that? Yeah. So you're already jaded like I am, right? You should be excited about that. And then we get into chapter 13 and 14. And in 13 and 14, you already know this story. They say, hey, let's go check out the land, right? Send 12 spies. How many good reports come back? 2. Who were they? Joshua and Caleb. 10 reports come back that are not so good. And I want to read a little bit of those reports. Look with me in verse 27 of chapter 13. This should be on your screen. Chapter 13, verse 27. And when they came back, they said this, and I told him, we came to the land to which you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. I mean, so they brought back some good stuff, right? However, you remember when you were dating that first girl, guys? And she says, you're a nice guy. But And you knew what was coming next, right? Then the whole friend conversation. Well, that's what's about to happen here, right? It was all good. We had this nice fruit. However, the people dwell in the land and are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there, and the Amalekites dwell in the land of Negeb, and then they just keep going on and on and on. And basically what they're saying is, hey, look, the land was good. Look at verse 31. Then the men who had gone up with him were not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they have spied out, saying, the land through which have gone into the spied out is the land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are of great height. In other words, we can occupy the land. God, I know you said it's ours. I know you called it a land flowing with milk and honey, and you're right, there's milk and honey, but there are big people there. There are giants there. There's anguish there. And if we go, they will devour us. Now, at any point, do you see anything in that passage that says, God, but we trust you? God, but we trust you. God, I don't know how I'm going to overcome the battle, but God, we trust you. Do you see that anywhere? Now, just real quick, and we'll keep moving. Does that sound like us sometimes in our lives? Now, look how Israel responded to this pain. Chapter 14, verse 1 through 4 says this. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept at night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against who? Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we have died in the land of Egypt, or that we would have died in the wilderness? Why is the Lord bring us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to... Do you hear what they're saying? Let's go back to bondage. Let's go back. And they said to one another, let us choose a leader to take us back to Egypt. I mean, they have lost their mind, right? Yeah, go ahead.
This isn't the first time they've done this, right?
No. At the Red Sea. At the Red Sea they did this. They said the same stupid thing at the Red Sea. And now they're there. They are miles. They started out 11 days journey. They are miles and days within grasp of the promised land. And they conclude after spying it out, hey, let's pick a different leader because Moses isn't cutting it. Aaron's not cutting it. Let's pick someone that will take us a month journey back to Egypt. Let's go back to slavery. Now think about that for a moment. Is that not absurd to think about? Anybody, is that absurd? But I would contend that when we have perpetual sin in our life, we're doing the same thing, right? You've been freed from the power and the bondage and the penalty of sin, but some of us keep going back to the same sin. We keep going back to the same bondage. And when we look at Israel going, how dare they think that way? We do the same stuff. It just sounds different. It looks a little different, right? And then look at Moses here in verse 7 through 9. Moses gives a speech. And he says, and he said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, the land which was passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into the land and give it to us, and the land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. He gives this great speech of, listen, I know they're big, but God is with us. The Creator God. Hey, do you remember the sea? And God just kind of, whoop. Do you remember the manna that was falling from heaven? That God. Do you remember the God who was a fire by night to keep us warm and a cloud by day to keep us cool? Do you remember the God that has been leading us, that gave us a place to worship, that showed up? Do you remember him? Just trust him. Stop doubting him. Don't rebel against the Lord. And I'm sure this was like the best coach's speech he could have ever given, right? And I'm thinking Israel is going to go, you're right. Man, you're right, Moses. Let's march on. Verse 30 says this. Verse 30. I'm sorry, let's go here. Chapter 14, there you go. Verse 30. It says, and not one of you shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb and the son of Japheth and this Joshua, the son of Nun. In other words, which report do they embrace? The bad reports or the good reports? The bad. And so God brings judgment, and the judgment is this. You will not enter the land. I've had enough of your doubting. I've had enough of your rebellion. Let me just lay all the cards on the table. You ready? You're not going to get the land. You are never going to see the land. Now think about it. A whole generation is lost with a decision. You're never going to enter into the land because over and over again they forgot the protection, the provision of God. Now they will pay the price. A whole generation will miss it. And that verse launches them into the 40 years of wandering, which leads us to the next section of Numbers. Israel wandering in the wilderness. Now, if you think about Israel's wandering in the wilderness, a couple of things I want you to think about. One is you think, okay, if God has punished them this severely, would that probably wake them up? Wouldn't you think it would wake them up? Hey, we're headed to the promised land. We've blown it. We're not going to get in. Maybe we were wrong. Well, what you find out as you look through the passage of the next few chapters is that the hearts remain hard and rebellion continues. And then you have something called the rebellion of Korah. Korah's rebellion, Korah was a Levite. Korah took 250 chief people, and they stood against Moses, and they said, look, we can do a better job than you can do. Everyone in Israel's chosen, not just you, and we don't have to obey you. We don't have to listen to you, Moses, anymore. Now, at that point, if I'm Moses, I'm going, okay, God, let's do something else. I mean, you've already brought fire, you brought plagues, whatever you got, let them have it. But Moses doesn't do that. Moses weeps and pleads. Now, the reason I keep pulling up Moses here, sometimes I think we have a wrong view of Moses, right? Sometimes I think we have a view of Moses of just being this guy who had all these doubts and all these excuses and kind of whined his way through helping God out. But the truth of the matter is, Moses loved his people, right? Moses prayed and pleaded with God on behalf of his people. And so once again, he does that. And what Moses does is he prays and he pleads and he weeps and then he straightens them out. He tells them exactly what he's thinking, and he tells them that their rebellion is actually against God, not him. Now, I don't have time to go through the whole story of Korah and the rebellion, but Korah had two others that were the ringleaders of this mess. And it got so bad toward the end of Moses' speech, telling them what was going to happen, God decides, here's how I'm going to deal with it. You guys, those people that want to be on their team, you need to get away from these three because they're about to face consequences like you've never seen before. And it says the people left them and got away from them, and all of a sudden, God opened up the ground, and it swallowed all of them. Families, friends, all those that were on board with that, the ground opened up and consumed them all, right? Now, I'm thinking, okay, we've seen a lot. Maybe now, right? Maybe now we'll obey. Well, the wandering continues, right? The wandering continues, and as you get to the end of the wandering, as you get to like chapter 19 of the book of Numbers, you see that now there is a new generation of Israelites. Now they've come to the place of Kadesh. The problem at Kadesh is they have no water. And so guess what they do with Moses? They whine. Yeah, they whine. They're still whining. Moses. And here's where we see the epic failure of Moses. God tells Moses to speak to the rock. But what does Moses do? Strikes it not once, but twice. Total rebellion. Now, I'm just going to be honest with you. As I read the story, there's a part of me I'm going to go, God, you've shown Israel so much grace. Give your guy a break, right? I mean, if I'm Moses, I would have struck them in the head with a stick first. I mean, I've had it with Israel. Wouldn't you have had it with Israel? At every turn, now they're rejecting God, but they are usurping your authority. They're saying you're not the man. I mean, at every turn, if I'm Moses going, hey, I could have stayed with my father-in-law Jethro in the middle of the wilderness, being a shepherd, and been totally okay. God, you called me out of this, and these people are nuts. But it's because of what Moses does here that Moses now, God tells him, you will not enter the land either. So it's not just a generation that misses it, it's Moses as well. So this time of moving from Sinai to Kadesh is filled with complaining, it's filled with faithlessness, it's filled with rebellion, and it is filled with disobedience. And then I got to pick up my pace a little bit. Let's go quickly through the rest of Numbers. And Kadesh to the plains of Moab is the last section of Numbers from chapter 20 through chapter 36. Now, in chapter 20, you see a lot of different things happen. In 21, you see that Aaron dies. You see that the military, they have a small victory over the Canaanites. But then you see in chapter 21, people become impatient with God again. They just aren't learning their lessons. They become impatient with God, and they challenge God's plan. And what does God send their way? Chapter 21. Anybody know? Poisonous snakes, right? He sends them poisonous snakes. So the people do what the people do best. They cry out to Moses. Moses, help us out. So Moses prays, goes to God. God says, you build a bronze serpent, and all they have to do is look to it, and they will be healed. Now, once again, Israel's not learning any lessons. They're whining the whole time. God punishes them, and once again, God shows them grace. You see that? You see that rhythm? We haven't even got to the book of Judges yet, and we're seeing that rhythm. Are you there? Are you there with me? Now, what do we have to look to find healing and salvation? Yeah, this is a picture of the cross, right? Are you with me on that? Yes. The Son of Man will be lifted up so that he might draw men to himself, right? So this is a foreshadowing of Jesus. And then you have toward the chapter 22 of Numbers, you see a second approach to the land. So the wandering years are coming to an end, and they're beginning their journey back to the promised land. A whole generation is dead now. They've all got, except Moses. Most of them are dead now, and they're beginning to the plains of Moab. And the king of Moab decides, I don't want Israel here. I don't like Israel. They are a problem. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hire like a sorcerer kind of guy named Balaam, and I'm going to ask Balaam to curse Israel. Now, I'm not making this up. This is Numbers chapter 22. You should read this later because this is one great story. And so Balaam is on his way to do his thing, and his donkey that he's riding on sees an angel of the Lord. Balaam doesn't see the angel of the Lord. And the donkey stops. And Balaam still wants the donkey to go. So what does Balaam begin to do? Beats the donkey. And then the most amazing miracle happens in the world. The donkey begins to speak, right? My dad had a saying for this, but I can't repeat it tonight, right? The donkey begins to speak. He begins to talk and begins to direct him that the angel of the Lord is trying to stop him. And then Balaam sees it. And then what happens in the story, you need to read it because it's such a beautiful story. In Numbers 22, what happens is Balaam goes from cursing Israel to now he blesses Israel. He goes against the king Balak and he begins to bless Israel. But yet Israel doesn't learn their lesson, because Israel begins to be seduced with religious seductions. In fact, listen to this. In Numbers chapter 25, it says this. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. They invited the people to sacrifice their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods, so that Israel's yoke himself to Baal or Peor. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord. The fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And Moses said to all the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of the men who have yoked themselves with Baal or Peor. In other words, listen, with all that's going on, I've got a guy that wanted to curse you, but now I've intervened, and now he's blessing you, and you still are whoring yourself with other gods. And it's time to stop. Now listen, do you see how God pleads with Israel over and over again to be just a nation that's set apart? Just be my people. Just love me. Live for me and be my people. And over and over again, they refuse, right? And then after this happens, they take another census, probably because they've lost a whole generation. They want to know exactly who's going to be with them now. Joshua at this point is named successor in the book of Numbers. And then a new generation is reminded of all the offerings that they're supposed to give to God. And as they get close to the promised land, something really interesting happens. 2.5 tribes decides they don't want to go in. 2.5 tribes decide they would rather stay in the plains of Moab, the desert of Moab, and live there, raise their animals there, their families there, than go into the land flowing with milk and honey. In fact, we have a chart, the boundaries that are given in Moab. What you can find out, here's the Jordan River where they would have crossed to go in the promised land, and you've got the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and a clan out of Manasseh, because Manasseh had, they were half of a tribe, and a clan there that decides they want to stay. And they stay east of the Jordan River and never enter into the promised land. Now, the requirement was you have to help everybody else get over, and then you can come settle back in this land. So what happens is Joshua and Moses, they tell everybody the allotment of land they get. You can see that there. You can look this up on Google. But there's different allotments that everybody gets as far as it's related to land. Now, the book of Numbers ends with, for the most part, the establishment of cities of refuge. Cities of refuge were 6 cities that were allocated. And in fact, actually, these little red dots, I think they're all 6 there, are these cities of refuge. And they were allocated places for people to go. They were asylums for people that were foreigners to be safe. But it was also asylums for people who had committed unintentional manslaughter for them to go to be safe until trial came. And so that's how, for the most part, the book of Numbers ends. It ends with them at the plains of Moab, impatient, loaded with idolatry, lack of trust, but yet God still blesses them. And that's how the book of Numbers ends. Now, the book of Deuteronomy. This won't take us long to go through, so give me a few minutes. If I take you over like 5 minutes, is that okay? Okay, if it's not, I'm sorry. I'm going to keep going anyway. All right, so here we go. Deuteronomy. Purpose of the book. First of all, it's a restatement of the covenant of God. The book of Deuteronomy reads so much like everything we've already read and talked about. But if you think about it, why is it important to restate the covenant? Because this is the next generation, right? And they need to be reminded of the covenant. They need to be reminded, how do you live in context of this covenant? One of my favorite words in the Bible is the word remember. You remember when Jesus fed the 4,000, not the 5, but the 4,000 in the Gospel of Mark, and they're all getting on the boat, and they forgot the bread, and the disciples begin to argue about who forgot the bread, and Jesus stops them and says, hey, wait a minute. Don't you remember when I broke the bread? Don't you remember when I fed the 4? He's like, don't you remember when I did all this stuff? Now, the funny thing is, they had one loaf with them. And I'm just saying, if they had a few loaf and a few fish, and Jesus fed thousands and thousands of people, could he have fed 12 people with one loaf? Yeah. And Jesus says, you've forgotten already. When we take the Lord's Supper, what does Paul say? That we're to do it in what? Remembrance. So remembering is a part of the story. In fact, you see this all the way through Israel's history that they're supposed to come back and remember. So part of the purpose of the book of Deuteronomy is a restatement of the covenant of God. So they will remember. Second of all, the purpose is to encourage a new generation to live accordingly. A new generation needs to live accordingly to the commands and the covenant that God has given. And the best chapter, the thematic chapter in the book of Deuteronomy is Deuteronomy chapter 6. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 6, there's a prayer and a statement that's given called the Shema, that is the heartbeat of Israel. And I'll talk about it in a minute. And after the heartbeat is given, then they talk about what does it mean to love God. The Shema is Shema, Israel, Adonai, Elohenu, Adonai, Echad. That means, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Don't forget, you are following the creator of the universe. I'm not one God of many. I am the only God. And I am Echad. I am one. And then he goes on. We won't read it for sake of time. And then he goes on and talks about, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5 through 9, exactly what it means to love God. Now, as far as the structure of the book, the entire structure of the book follows the covenant format. Remember the covenant we talked about where there's a preamble, a prologue, there's stipulations, there's kind of these sanctions, and then there's blessings and cursings and witnesses. The entire book follows that protocol. So the entire book is laid out in kind of a covenantal form, but the book is specifically laid out in 3 speeches that Moses gives. 3 speeches that Moses has given. If you give me a couple of minutes here, I want to give you those real quickly. The first speech is found in chapter 1, chapter 1 all the way through chapter 4, verse 43. That's where the first one is found. And basically this first speech is all about what has God done for us. So Moses gave a speech on the east side of the Jordan River. They're on the east side of the Jordan River. Talking about the 11-day march that took 40 years. They're on the east side of the Jordan River. And this part of the passage serves as the historical prologue. Where has God taken us over the years? It's all about remembering. It's about remembering our rebellion. It's about remembering the wandering years of another generation. It's about remembering the battles and victories that God has given us thus far. And it's also about remembering how the land's to be divided. So this first speech is kind of this historical prologue. How did we get here? How has God blessed us? What lies ahead for us? And at the end of this first speech, Moses, and we don't have time to read it tonight, but Moses pleaded with them to obey the commands of God, to stay clear of idolatry, And then what should motivate them? What should motivate them is that they serve the one true God. You can read this later in chapter 4, verse 32 through 40. We won't read it right now. We don't have time. This is where Moses talks about how the one God they follow is the one and the only true God. In fact, that is your homework before you go to bed tonight. Read Numbers chapter 4, verse 32 through 40. It's a beautiful passage of how Moses says we worship the one true God. And then his second speech in Deuteronomy is found in chapter 5 through chapter 28. And this is where, if the first speech was about like the prologue, this is the stipulations in the covenant. These whole chapters from 5 through 28 is his stipulations and the covenant. Meaning this, he restates the 10 Commandments in these chapters, okay? You remember the 10 Commandments? We have these up here, right? These are the 10 Commandments. You remember those, right? Remember, that's what Mount Sinai, Exodus chapter 20. These are 10 Commandments gives. The beautiful thing about Deuteronomy is Moses takes the 10 and he expands on them. He expands on them. Let me give you 2 charts that kind of helps you with that. The first one's done by a guy named Van Pelt, and he takes the 10 Commandments and he'll tell you what they're about. Like, say, number 1, it's first commandment, it's all about monotheism. It's about one God. You shall have no other God before me, right? You can find that in Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. You can find it in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 7. And you can see Moses expand on it from Deuteronomy 6 all the way to chapter 11. Does that make sense? You have that in your handouts, right? Yes. So you can see how Van Pelt goes, here's the theme of each commandment, and here's how we see Moses expand on it in the book of Deuteronomy. Let me give you another one. It's probably my favorite. It's by a guy by the name of Walton, and he gives a different chart. He says there's 4 overarching themes in the 10 Commandments: authority, dignity, commitment, rights, and privileges. And what he does is he takes the first 4 commandments on the left side, he tells you where they're found, and he talks about what they're about a little bit, like God should be our top priority, our final authority. We owe him preference and obedience. That's authority. And then he takes the other 5, which are related to man. So you've got divine commandments, and you've got human commandments. How do we interact with others? And he takes those and shows you how the same issues is applicable in the first commandment as well as the 5th commandment. Do you see that? Okay? You may need to chew on that a little bit. I gave you that chart for that reason, because what the point is this, is when you read the book of Deuteronomy, really from chapter 5, from chapter 6 on, really, it's all about Moses expanding on the 10 Commandments. So when you say, you shall have no other God before me, what does that mean? What does that look like? Moses takes 5 chapters and tells us what it looks like. What does it mean that I would not covet my neighbor's wife? What does that mean? Okay, he takes chapters and expands on it. So when you look at the book of Deuteronomy and you begin to read it, what you find out is that Moses is expanding on the 10 Commandments through most of the book of Deuteronomy. Does that make sense? Are you got any questions? Does that make sense? Okay, chapter 5 through 28. So you may have never known that about the book, but that's exactly what the book's about. Now, his third speech, and then he ends the speech with like blessings and cursings. Like if you do this, you'll be blessed. If you don't, you won't, okay? And then his third speech and final speech, he gives a summary of the covenant. And he calls for immediate commitment. If there's one thing you got to get when you read the laws, he says the same thing over and over and over and over and over. You know why? Because humans are like sheep. And what are sheep? Yeah, they're not very smart, right? So you say it over and over and over again, right? So he reissues the summary of the covenant, calls for commitment, and then he encourages obedience. And here's what he says: if you will obey, you'll get to stay long in the land. But if you don't, you won't. You're about to enter into a land that God has for you. And you've been through a lot of this over the last several years. Your parents rebelled and wandered. You've been complaining. You've had issues. But God has given you a land. And we want you to take it. But if you rebel against God and you don't keep his commands, your time in that land is going to be short-lived. Now, because we've already read the rest of the Old Testament, their time in the land was short, wasn't it? You had different groups that came in. We'll see this when we get to the kingdom, the monarchy, that becomes a divided monarchy and has different groups that come in and run Israel out of those places. Their time in the land didn't last that long. And then the end of Deuteronomy, chapter 31 through 34, you see several things, and we won't have time to read this, Todd, so don't put it up there. But you see, first of all, Joshua's going to take over. Joshua's the man for the job. And Moses tells Joshua the profound verse. He says, be strong and courageous. It's a beautiful passage of Moses passing the baton, the torch down to Joshua. And then you see Moses talk about the reading of this book. In fact, I do want to read this. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 9 through 13. Here we go. Listen to this. Then Moses wrote the law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the same time in the year of release, at the feast of booths, when all of Israel come to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all men of Israel in their hearing. In other words, I want all of Israel every 7 years at this particular time to be reminded of everything that I've just told you. Assemble the people, men and women, little ones, and sojourners within your towns, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do all the word of this law. And that the children who have not known it may hear it, learn to fear the Lord your God, and as long as you live in the land that you're going over to the Jordan to possess. In other words, I want you to read the law over and over again. I want the people to never have the law away from them. Now, something very, very sad that you may not know. They end up losing the book of Deuteronomy, the book of law. We'll find this out later, but during the reign of Josiah, who was king, by the way, I think it was like 8 or 10, he became king, which is kind of funny. Imagine your kids reigning in your house. Well, they probably already do. But anyway, he became king, and on his crusade to tear down the false idols and to reestablish that God is the God to be served and worshiped, as they were cleaning up the temple, they found the book of the law. Most scholars would say it's the book of Deuteronomy, and it was hidden, it was covered up, which means there was a point in Israel history where they no longer read the book of Deuteronomy. There's a point in Israel history where they forgot the covenant they had with the holy God. And so he says, I want you to read this. And then Moses gives a couple of songs, he blesses them, and the last thing I want to read in the book of Deuteronomy is the very end. I told Christy, as she was putting this together, I said, I feel like I just watched one of those movies that doesn't end with happily ever after. Listen to this, and then we're going to close. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed, meaning he didn't have bad eyesight, and his vigor unabated, meaning he still was energetic. He wasn't like withering away. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, and those days of weeping and mourning for Moses was dead had ended. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of the wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. You remember that imagery of hands? He's passed on leadership to him. In verse 10, and there was not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent to him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to his servants, to all the land, and all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of Israel, of all of Israel. And I caught on this, and there's not another one like Moses. What a man of God, right? Leading ungodly people. And so as we end the book of Deuteronomy, we end with the passing of the torch. Moses dies, and Israel is waiting to enter the land. And that's where we'll pick up in 3 weeks. Okay? So if you want some reading, Doug, what will we cover next time? Let me tell you. Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Okay? Beautiful books. If you want some reading over the next 3 weeks, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. All right, let's pray, and we'll let you guys get out of here. Thank you for the extra 3 minutes. God, I love you. I thank you for tonight. I know there's so much information that we move through here, Lord, but the thing that keeps sticking out to me is how you kept blessing Israel in the face of the rebellion. How Moses, when he should have turned on his people and asked you to crush them, he got on his knees and he wept for them. God, may we be those kind of people. People that love those that seem to be unlovable, love those that seem to not want to be loved by us. But God, may you give us the wisdom to live a life that is honoring and pleasing to you, Lord. You're moving us somewhere in our lives. And I pray our story is not like Israel's story, that our story is not filled with rebellion and wanting to go back to moments of slavery and bondage, but moments where we want to experience what Jesus said is the abundant life. So God, would you be with us? Would you give us strength? Would you bless us as we go tonight? For it's in your precious Son's name we pray. And everybody said amen? Amen. Amen. All right, see you guys. Have a great week.